The television courtroom had never witnessed such pure, unfiltered privilege meeting its absolute destruction. Madison Whitmore, a 19-year-old with perfectly highlighted blonde hair and a designer outfit that cost more than most people's monthly rent, sat in the defendant's chair with the kind of smug superiority that could only come from someone who had never faced real consequences in her entire life. Her manicured nails drummed against the armrest with practiced impatience. Her lips curved into a condescending smirk that told everyone watching she believed this was all just a minor inconvenience that her father's name would make disappear. She had no idea that she was sitting across from Judge Judy Hub, a woman who had spent 25 years crushing entitled people before Madison was even born, and that what she was about to say would trigger the fastest, most brutal judicial takedown in courtroom television history. The words were already forming on her perfectly glossed lips, her mouth opening to deliver the line that would destroy her father's political career, bankrupt her family, and turn her into the most hated teenager in America. "My dad is the governor. You can't do this to me." The silence that followed was absolutely nuclear. Every person in that courtroom felt the atmosphere shift from professional proceedings to something far more dangerous, something that would be replayed millions of times across every social media platform imaginable. Judge Judy's eyes narrowed into the kind of death stare that had made seasoned attorneys break down on national television, that expression of controlled fury that told you your world was about to end. But what happened in the next 15 seconds would become the most viral courtroom moment in internet history, a response so devastating, so perfectly calibrated that it would be studied in law schools and shared by millions of people who were hungry to see entitled privilege finally meet accountability. Before we show you the exact 15-second response that destroyed this rich girl's entire life and ended her father's career as governor, you need to understand something. This isn't just another courtroom case. This is the story of how one moment of arrogance cost a family everything they had built over decades. Hit that like button right now if you believe that privilege shouldn't protect anyone from facing consequences for their actions. Make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications because what Judge Judy reveals about Madison's pattern of behavior will absolutely shock you to your core. Trust me when I tell you that the next 25 minutes will restore your faith in justice and prove that karma is not only real, but it has absolutely perfect timing. This is the kind of content that reminds us why Judge Judy has been America's favorite television judge for over 2 decades. She doesn't care about your connections, your money, or your father's political position. In her courtroom, everyone is equal, and everyone faces the same standard of accountability. Madison Whitmore had lived her entire life in a bubble of absolute privilege that most people couldn't even imagine. She was the only daughter of Governor Robert Whitmore, a man who had climbed the political ladder over 20 years to reach the highest office in the state. From the moment Madison was born, she had been surrounded by luxury, power, and the kind of access that made her believe she was fundamentally different from ordinary people. She grew up in the governor's mansion with unlimited credit cards, a fleet of expensive cars at her disposal, and an army of staff members whose job was essentially to make sure she never heard the word no. Her childhood had been a parade of private schools where tuition cost more than college, designer clothes that she wore once and discarded, and exclusive parties where the guest list read like a who's who of political and social elite families. By the time Madison turned 16 and got her driver's license, she had already internalized the most dangerous lesson a person can learn. The rules don't apply to me. Her first car was a brand new BMW, a Sweet 16 present that cost $75,000. She totaled it within 3 months by rear-ending another vehicle while texting and driving. The other driver had been ready to call the police and press charges, but within 24 hours the governor's chief of staff had made the problem disappear with a quiet settlement and a non-disclosure agreement. Madison learned from that incident, but not the lesson her parents probably hoped she would learn. She didn't learn to be more careful or more responsible. She learned that her father's position meant she could escape any consequence as long as the family had enough money and influence to make victims go away quietly. Over the next 3 years, Madison would be involved in 6 more car accidents, each one following the same pattern of reckless behavior followed by her father's office making the problem disappear before it could damage his political career or her privileged lifestyle. The incident that finally brought Madison Whitmore into Judge Judy's courtroom happened on a sunny Tuesday afternoon in March, and it would prove to be the one mistake her father's money and influence couldn't make disappear. Madison was driving her third car, an $85,000 Mercedes G-Wagon that she had received as a college enrollment gift, even though she had barely attended any classes at her expensive private university. She was speeding through a shopping center parking lot at nearly 40 miles per hour in a zone clearly marked for 15, her phone in one hand as she scrolled through Instagram, her other hand barely touching the steering wheel. She never even saw the parked Honda Civic before she slammed into it with enough force to send her own massive SUV lurching forward and the smaller car spinning sideways into a light pole. The impact was devastating, turning a 10-year-old but well-maintained vehicle into a twisted wreck of metal and shattered glass. Madison sat in her vehicle for maybe 10 seconds, checking her face in the mirror to make sure she wasn't injured, before she did something that security cameras would capture in crystal-clear high definition. She laughed. She actually laughed as she looked at the destroyed car, said something to her friend in the passenger seat that made them both giggle, and then she simply drove away from the scene without leaving any information, without checking if anyone was hurt, without taking any responsibility whatsoever for the destruction she had just caused. The owner of that destroyed Honda Civic was Sarah Martinez, a 34-year-old single mother who was inside the grocery store buying food for her 2 young children when Madison's reckless driving destroyed the only vehicle she owned. Sarah worked as an emergency room nurse at the county hospital, pulling double shifts and working extra hours at a free clinic just to make ends meet and provide for her 6-year-old daughter and 8-year-old son. She had saved money for 3 years to buy that Honda Civic, sacrificing every luxury and working holidays and weekends to afford reliable transportation that would get her to work and get her children to school safely. When Sarah came out of that grocery store with her bags and saw her car completely totaled, her first emotion wasn't anger. It was pure terror. Without a car, she couldn't get to work. Without work, she couldn't pay rent or feed her children. That single moment of Madison's carelessness threatened to unravel everything Sarah had worked so hard to build for her family. She stood there in the parking lot, groceries scattered around her feet, staring at the wreckage of her life while her hands shook and tears streamed down her face. The security footage that captured the entire incident showed Madison's license plate clearly, and within hours the police had tracked the vehicle to the governor's mansion. But what happened next revealed a pattern of corruption that went far beyond one spoiled teenager's reckless behavior. Before the police could even complete their report, before Sarah had even been contacted by investigators, a lawyer from one of the state's most expensive firms showed up at Sarah's modest apartment. He arrived with a briefcase full of documents and an offer that he presented as if he was doing Sarah an enormous favor. The governor's office was prepared to pay her $5,000 in exchange for signing a settlement agreement and a non-disclosure agreement that would prevent her from ever speaking publicly about the accident or Madison's involvement. $5,000 for a car that would cost at least $8,000 to replace, and all she had to do was promise to never tell anyone what really happened. The lawyer made it very clear that this was a generous offer, that fighting the governor's family would be expensive and futile, and that Sarah should be grateful they were willing to help her at all. Sarah Martinez was exhausted, terrified, and desperate, but she was not stupid. Something about the lawyer's aggressive approach and the speed with which he had appeared at her door made her suspicious. She asked for time to think about the offer, and the lawyer's friendly demeanor immediately changed into something cold and threatening. He told her that the offer was only available for 24 hours, that refusing it would be a serious mistake, and that she should think very carefully about what was best for her children before making any hasty decisions. That thinly veiled threat was what changed everything for Sarah. She had grown up poor, she had worked her way through nursing school while raising 2 children alone, and she had faced down aggressive patients and dangerous situations in the emergency room. She was not going to be intimidated by some expensive lawyer trying to protect a rich girl who had destroyed her property and fled the scene like a coward. Sarah Martinez made a decision that night that would change everything. Instead of signing the settlement agreement, she started doing research, and what she discovered made her blood run cold with anger. She found local news stories about hit-and-run accidents involving luxury vehicles that had been mysteriously resolved without charges being filed. She found social media posts from people asking if anyone else had been pressured by lawyers representing powerful families to sign non-disclosure agreements after accidents. She found a pattern that suggested Madison Whitmore had been doing this for years, and every single victim had been paid off in silence before the story could gain any traction. Sarah reached out to 3 of those previous victims through private messages, and what they told her was horrifying. One woman had been sideswiped by Madison on the highway and forced off the road, resulting in injuries that required physical therapy for months. Another man had his truck destroyed when Madison ran a red light and T-boned him at an intersection. A third victim was an elderly couple whose car Madison had hit in a parking garage before speeding away. Every single one of them had been approached by the same law firm, offered settlements that barely covered their damages, and threatened with expensive legal battles if they refused to sign the non-disclosure agreements. Every single one of them had taken the money because they couldn't afford to fight a governor's office with unlimited resources and political connections. But Sarah was different. She was tired of watching powerful people escape consequences while ordinary working families suffered. She was tired of being told that standing up for herself would only make things worse. She was tired of a system that seemed designed to protect the privileged while crushing everyone else under legal threats and financial pressure. She refused to sign the settlement agreement, and that's when the real harassment began. Within a week of refusing the offer, Sarah started experiencing problems at her job. Anonymous complaints were filed against her at the hospital, claiming she had been rude to patients and had made medication errors. None of these complaints had any basis in reality. Sarah had worked at that hospital for 8 years with a spotless record and glowing reviews from supervisors and patients alike. But suddenly there were investigation meetings, written warnings being placed in her file, and whispers among staff that she might be facing suspension or termination. She noticed a man in a dark sedan parked outside her apartment building multiple times, clearly surveilling her movements. Her children came home from school one day and told her that a stranger had been asking their teachers questions about their family. The message was clear. Drop this case, accept the settlement, or watch everything you've built for your family get destroyed piece by piece. The pressure from the hospital administration became unbearable when Sarah's supervisor called her into a private meeting and suggested, with obvious discomfort, that it might be in everyone's best interest if Sarah reconsidered her position on this legal matter that was causing so much unnecessary stress. The supervisor wouldn't say it directly, but the implication was crystal clear. The governor's office had made calls, had applied pressure, and Sarah's job was now in jeopardy because she refused to let Madison Whitmore escape accountability for destroying her car and her life. Sarah's children started asking why the mean girl's daddy was trying to hurt them. Her 6-year-old daughter had nightmares about bad men taking their mommy away. Her 8-year-old son started getting into fights at school because other kids were teasing him about his mom being in trouble with the governor. The emotional toll on her family was devastating, and there were nights when Sarah lay awake wondering if she was being selfish by fighting back instead of just taking the money and moving on with her life. Everything changed when Sarah found an online support group for victims of hit-and-run accidents, and she shared her story about Madison Whitmore and the aggressive cover-up attempts by the governor's office. Her post was seen by a civil rights attorney named Marcus Webb, who had made his career fighting cases against powerful families and corrupt officials who believed they were above the law. Marcus reached out to Sarah and offered to represent her pro bono, not because he needed the money, but because he was disgusted by the pattern of behavior he saw in Madison's history and the blatant abuse of power by the governor's office to protect his daughter from facing any consequences. Marcus immediately filed a lawsuit against Madison Whitmore for the full cost of replacing Sarah's vehicle, her lost wages from missed work, and compensation for the emotional distress caused by the harassment and intimidation she had endured. He also sent copies of all the evidence, including the security footage and the threatening communications from the governor's lawyer, to local news stations and investigative journalists who had been looking for exactly this kind of story about corruption in the governor's administration. The story of Madison Whitmore's hit and run and the governor's attempted cover-up went viral on local social media within 48 hours of Marcus Webb releasing the security footage to the press. The video showing Madison laughing as she surveyed the damage before driving away was shared thousands of times, with people expressing outrage at the entitled behavior and the obvious attempt to make the problem disappear with money and legal intimidation. When producers from Judge Judy's show reached out to Marcus Webb about bringing the case to national television, he knew immediately that this was the platform Sarah needed. Judge Judy had a reputation for absolutely destroying entitled people who thought their money or connections made them special, and Marcus believed that exposing Madison's behavior to millions of viewers would make it impossible for the governor's office to continue their cover-up campaign. Sarah was terrified at the prospect of going on national television, worried about the additional scrutiny and potential retaliation from even more powerful people, but Marcus convinced her that sunlight was the best disinfectant for corruption. Judge Judy's research team spent an entire week investigating Madison's history before the taping, and what they uncovered was even worse than anyone had suspected. They found all 7 previous accidents, obtained copies of all the settlement agreements that previous victims had signed, tracked down financial records showing that some of the settlement money had actually come from the governor's campaign funds, which was completely illegal, and even found text messages between Madison and her friends where she openly mocked her victims and bragged about never facing consequences because of her father's position. Madison Whitmore had no idea about the depth of Judge Judy's investigation when she arrived at the courthouse for taping. She treated the entire experience like it was a fun day trip, an amusing story she would tell at parties about the time she went on a television court show. She posted Instagram stories showing herself getting ready in her hotel room, trying on multiple designer outfits before settling on a Chanel suit that cost $3,200, doing her makeup while her friends commented about how she was going to destroy this TV judge who didn't understand how the real world worked. Her father had hired Thomas Berkshire, an attorney who charged $800 per hour and who had successfully kept Madison out of trouble on all 7 previous occasions by aggressively threatening victims and making problems disappear before they could become public scandals. Thomas had tried 4 separate times to get the case dismissed before it reached Judge Judy's courtroom, arguing everything from improper jurisdiction to technicalities about the filing paperwork, but every motion had been denied. He had even called in political favors to try to pressure the show's producers into dropping the case, but Judge Judy had built her entire career on being completely immune to that kind of influence, and she had made it very clear that Madison Whitmore would face the same standard of accountability as any other defendant who walked through her courtroom doors. The courtroom atmosphere was electric when Madison walked in with her entourage, which included her expensive attorney, her father's press secretary who was there to do damage control, and 2 of her socialite friends who treated the whole thing like they were attending a fashion show rather than a legal proceeding. Madison was wearing designer sunglasses indoors, carrying a Gucci purse that cost more than Sarah's destroyed car, and walking with the kind of confident stride that told everyone she believed this would all be over in 5 minutes with a ruling in her favor. She completely ignored Sarah Martinez when they were in the same waiting room, didn't even glance in her direction, instead laughing loudly with her friends about their plans to go shopping after this boring court appearance was finished. She was loud enough that everyone could hear her say that this whole thing was ridiculous, that the poor woman should have just taken the money, and that her father's lawyers had already assured her that television court shows weren't real courts and their rulings could be easily overturned. What Madison didn't know, what she couldn't possibly have known because her bubble of privilege had never been penetrated by reality, was that Judge Judy Hub had presided over 20,000 real cases during her 25 years as a family court judge in Manhattan before her television career, that she had dealt with every type of entitled person imaginable, and that she had been waiting for a case exactly like this one to make an example that would be remembered for years. Judge Judy opened the proceedings with her signature no-nonsense approach, her voice cutting through the air with the kind of authority that made people sit up straighter in their chairs. "Miss Martinez, you're suing Miss Whitmore for damages resulting from a hit-and-run accident where your vehicle was completely destroyed. Tell me what happened." Sarah's testimony was quiet and dignified, her voice cracking slightly with emotion as she explained that she had been inside a grocery store buying food for her children when Madison crashed into her parked car with enough force to total it completely. She described coming outside to find her only means of transportation destroyed, explained how she had saved for 3 years to buy that Honda Civic, and detailed the devastating impact on her ability to work and care for her 2 young children. She presented photos of the destroyed vehicle, medical bills from stress-related health issues, and a suspension notice from her hospital job that had come immediately after she refused to sign the settlement agreement. When she mentioned how her children had been affected, how they were having nightmares and asking why the mean girl's daddy was trying to hurt them, her voice broke completely and tears streamed down her face. The audience was completely silent, captivated by this woman's story of trying to stand up against power and corruption while just trying to provide for her family. Judge Judy listened with the focused intensity that had made her a legend, asking clarifying questions and making notes, her expression growing harder with each detail of the harassment and intimidation that Sarah had endured. Then it was Madison's turn to present her side of the story, and the transformation in the courtroom atmosphere was immediate and dramatic. Madison strutted to the podium like she was walking a fashion runway instead of approaching a judge, her designer heels clicking against the floor with aggressive confidence. She opened with what was clearly a rehearsed apology that sounded about as sincere as a telemarketer reading from a script. "Your Honor, I want to start by saying I'm sorry that Miss Martinez's car was damaged. However, I think it's important to understand that this was just an unfortunate accident that could have happened to anyone." She then immediately pivoted to blaming Sarah, claiming that the parking spot had been in a confusing location, that the lighting in that section of the parking lot was poor, and that she hadn't realized the damage was as severe as it turned out to be. Judge Judy's first interruption came swift and sharp. "Miss Whitmore, I've seen the security footage. You were driving 40 miles per hour in a 15-mile-per-hour zone. You were looking at your phone. You hit a parked car with enough force to spin it into a light pole. Then you laughed, said something to your passenger, and drove away without leaving any information. Would you like to revise your statement about this being just an unfortunate accident?" The color drained slightly from Madison's face, but her attorney quickly interjected with objections about the admissibility of security footage and whether the timestamp could be verified. Judge Judy shut him down immediately with a look that could have frozen lava. "Counselor, your client is 19 years old and perfectly capable of speaking for herself. Sit down and be quiet unless I ask you a direct question." Madison was visibly flustered now, her practiced composure cracking around the edges as she realized this wasn't going according to the plan her expensive lawyers had prepared. Judge Judy leaned forward with the expression that regular viewers recognized as the calm before a devastating storm. "Miss Whitmore, is this your first car accident?" Madison hesitated, clearly trying to calculate what Judge Judy already knew, before answering carefully that she had been involved in a few minor incidents over the years but nothing serious. Judge Judy's smile was absolutely predatory. "A few minor incidents. Let's define a few, shall we? How many car accidents have you been involved in over the past 3 years?" Madison stammered that she didn't remember exactly, maybe 2 or 3, definitely nothing worth discussing in detail. Judge Judy opened a thick folder that had been sitting on her bench, the same folder that had made Madison's attorney visibly nervous from the moment he spotted it. "Try 7, Miss Whitmore. 7 accidents in 3 years. 7 victims whose vehicles you damaged. 7 settlement agreements paid by your father's office to make those victims